With the digestive system, there's four main things that you need to be concerned with. Number one is the anatomy of the digestive system. Number two is the polymer-monomer relationship. That is a biological concept. The four main types of organic molecules, you had carbohydrates, lipids or fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. So knowing the polymer-monomer relationship with that from the lecture. You also have enzymes that are going to be added from the saliva all the way down through the pancreas so that food absorption of nutrients can actually happen in the small intestine. And then a fourth thing to make sure that you key in on are the reflexes that occur within the tract. So those are all from lecture, but to start with, you need to know the anatomy of the tract from mouth to anus, the different organs that are involved, the parts of those organs, and then the three that food never enters. The big ones are the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Food never enters into those, but they're still vitally important for digestion. So you have your list of items, and each one is broken down. So starting with the major digestive organs, you're looking at the torso, the abdomen, especially the one on the right, has had the liver and the stomach removed so you can actually see the spleen and also the pancreas. But the liver in the upper left quadrant, sorry, the upper right quadrant of the abdomen, the upper right quadrant, the liver takes up most of that space directly beneath the diaphragm and the rib cage and the lungs. Underneath that, you can see the little green structure that's there is the balloon-like sac, which is the gallbladder. So you will get in lecture that the liver makes bile, the gallbladder stores bile, and then of course you can see the pancreas, and you recognize the spleen in the upper left quadrant. The pancreas lies within the J-shaped part of the stomach. So you see very little of the pancreas because the stomach covers over from the anterior view. Then of course you have the large intestines that go across on your lab. Sometimes I ask you particularly what are the parts. So from this figure you can see you have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then down where the S shape occurs on the large intestine would be the sigmoid, but you can also just call it the large intestine here. With the small intestines, again on some of the figures I'm asking you for the areas or the parts to the small intestine. So you would have the duodenum up near the stomach. Over here you would have the jejunum, and then down near the cecum of the large intestine you would have the ileum. So that it's in thirds, the small intestine in thirds, the large intestine based off of direction. Notice you also have this layer of fat and connective tissues. Remember, it does have a blood supply, lymphatic supply, and it's known as the mesentery. This is actually called the greater omentum. So it attaches at the base of the stomach and then at the lower pelvic area on the abdomen, and acts like an apron to hold the small intestines especially, but also the large intestines into place. The lesser omentum connects the base of the liver with the top of the stomach, and of course it's hidden by the lobe of the liver. And then of course the J-shaped organ that is there is the stomach, and we'll get to it in a second. As far as your pharynx, we've already done this from the respiratory standpoint, but now from a digestive view, you notice the hard palate versus the soft palate. Several people a lot of times will confuse that on the respiratory pharynx, but recognize that you have the maxillary bone and then your palatine bone. Then you have the soft palate at 2, and then what hangs down, the hangy down thing, is the uvula. Of course, we went and talked about the esophagus and the trachea on the anterior side, but now we're focusing on the pharynx and the esophagus. So labeled all the way down, you can see the muscular esophagus, where peristalsis takes over once the bolus of food hits the first portion of the esophagus. As far as this view of the stomach, you can see the exterior view where you have the cardiac region. So the heart lies up, of course, in the mediastinum area between the lungs. So the esophagus comes through that area and then enters into the stomach. So you have the cardiac region. You have this rounded area near the top, which is the fundic region. The majority of it is the body, and then it begins to narrow down again toward the pylorus and the duodenum, and that area, of course, is the pyloric region. So cardiac, near the heart, the rounded area is the fundic region, the major portion of it is the body, and then it narrows down into the pyloric region. As far as the musculature of the stomach, there's 3 layers of muscles, and you can look at those muscle fascicles, the fibers, and the direction in which they run. So from inside out, you have the oblique layer. They're coming in at an angle. Then you have this layer where they're wrapping all the way around. So that is the circular muscle. And then you have this layer that runs the length of the body. So from the fundic region all the way down through the body, that would be your longitudinal muscle. So on the list, longitudinal here, circular, and then oblique. And then of course you have the lesser curvature up near the diaphragm and the liver, and the greater curvature down around the body on the bottom side. As far as the interior view of the stomach, you have the cardiac orifice, so that's the actual area that's opened up. You have a sphincter muscle that is here. This is an anatomical sphincter known as the gastroesophageal sphincter. In lecture, we'll talk about physiological sphincters. They only will control the lumen when you're alive. So these disappear once you expire and you take your last breath. So they're only sphincters as long as you're living. This is an anatomical sphincter, though. It's a physical sphincter that's there to connect the esophagus with the cardiac region of the stomach. You also have the lining of the stomach with these extensions off of the wall of the stomach that are called gastric rugae. So these gastric rugae or rugae. The antrum is this major area where on the external view would have been the body. Then again it begins to narrow down toward the pylorus, which is this area, the opening, and you have the pyloric sphincter here. So the pyloric canal, the narrowing, the pylorus is the opening, and then you have another anatomical sphincter, which is the pyloric sphincter. As an overall view of the abdominal area, you notice, of course, the J-shaped portion of the stomach, the pyloric area that starts and begins the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. You can recognize underneath on this model where the pancreas lies directly inferior to the stomach and also very near the spleen. The 3 parts to the small intestine, we said the duodenum begins it, it goes underneath the transverse colon, and this area here in the upper left quadrant, or sorry, upper right quadrant would be your duodenum. You have this area over here, this third of the small intestine, which would be your jejunum. And then down here where this third of the small intestine is leading into the cecum of the large intestine would be the ileum. At the ileum, entering into the cecum of the large intestine, you have what we call the ileocecal valve or the ileocecal junction here. Remember, this is also within the ileum where you have your Peyer's patches that work with your immune system. And then the spleen, the pancreas, again, accessory organs located also in the abdomen around the digestive organs. With the large intestine, we begin here at the ileocecal valve, and you have this cup-like area that is known as the cecum. At the very bottom of that, you have this finger-like projection, which is the vermiform appendix. So notice anything that is emptied out into the cecum, like seeds, fingernails that people swallow, hairs, anything that is not digested and absorbed in the small intestine can fall into the appendix and can cause it to become inflamed and infected. From the cecum, you begin the the ascending colon. So the ascending colon going up on the right quadrant of the body. You have the right hepatic flexure. So the liver, remember, there's the liver. You can notice the inferior vena cava that's running through it. The liver lies in this area. So that first flexure there is on the right upper quadrant. It's also very near the bottom lobe of the liver. We said across would be the transverse colon. Then you have your left or splenic flexure. So the left colic flexure very near the spleen in the upper left quadrant. Then you have the descending part of the colon, but then it begins to take an S-shaped turn down in this area, and that would be the sigmoid colon that leads into the rectum, the anal canal in this area, and then of course your anal opening or anus. The teniae coli are these lines that run right through the middle of the large intestine. So you can see those coming all the way down. They're creating these little pockets which are known as haustra. So each individual pocket, whether I ask you on this side or here's one on this side or one of those over here like in the lab book, they're all a haustrum, these little pouch-like structures of the large intestine. They're created by these collagen fibers that run the length of the large intestine, which are the teniae coli. As far as the liver, remember it is an accessory organ, so externally you notice that you have the right lobe, you have the left lobe, you have the inferior vena cava that begins to come behind it. So on the underside view you can definitely see the vena cava there. You can also recognize the gallbladder. Coming out of the gallbladder you have the cystic duct. It merges with the common hepatic duct and becomes the common bile duct, which will empty in the duodenum. So once more, you have the gallbladder, the cystic duct coming out of it. A lot of times it's blocked with gallstones. It merges with the duct coming out of the liver, which is the proper, you also have the proper hepatic artery, and you have the hepatic portal vein that are also in this area. The common hepatic duct merges with the cystic and becomes the common bile duct as it goes and enters into the duodenum. You also have the caudate and quadrate lobes, so very near the gallbladder, and you also, it talks about in some lab books, the bear zone in that area. So you have the falciform ligament that is in the current lab book. You also have the bear area on the back side, but then you have your left lobe, the right lobe, which is much larger. So you can see the right lobe here, the left lobe smaller. So here's the left lobe, and then you have the quadrate lobe, and then near the inferior vena cava you have the caudate lobe. So cauda on the back side of the liver, and that of course is where you can see the inferior vena cava in both models run on the posterior side of the liver. As far as the histology of the liver, you have each individual circular areas which are called lobules. So you can see these hepatic lobules, each one of them, the center part of that is your central vein. So in every one of the histology pictures, you can see the bare area there, which is your central vein, arranged in these cuboid cells around that. You notice each one of them have a nucleus, and the little dark dot in each nucleus is the nucleolus. Those are the actual liver cells, which are the hepatocytes. You also have these white areas that's open. Remember, we've talked about these are called sinusoids in the liver. So these are the open cavities where blood cells or blood proteins or clotting factors can enter into the blood. So notice on the diagrams and the micrographs, you can see these white areas. So those are the sinusoids. You need to add that to your lab list. And the individual cells that you see here with the nucleus, it shows up better on this view, you have a hepatocyte or a liver cell arranged around the central vein.